guest today is Michael Sullivan, and he is the author of many books, but in particular the Ryra Revelations, Death of Swords, Rise of Empire, Era of Novron. I would like to introduce Michael Sullivan.
I'm Michael Sullivan, and I'm not a public speaker. In fact, I'm an author, which is like the farthest thing from a public speaker. I spend most of my time in a locked room avoiding talking to people. I make up people so I don't have to talk to people. So today I'm going to be talking about the changing trends in fantasy. Before we get started, I think we need to identify what is fantasy. And if you look it up, there's a noun and a verb. And the noun form of fantasy is imagination unrestricted by reality. And the verb form would be conceiving pleasant or satisfying mental images. And that is one of the things I'm going to latch on a little bit later in this discussion. But we're going to go back about 5,000 years to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is considered by most people to be one of the first pieces of literature ever written. And believe it or not, anyone here has sat down and read the Legend of Gilgamesh, it's kind of a buddy cop novel. Like you could picture, Mel Gibson and Danny Glover starring in this. Because it's these two guys who really don't like each other when they first meet. They get in this terrible fight, they hate each other, and then they start to like each other, and they go on this epic quest to defeat this demigod. The thing is that the Legend of Gilgamesh is actually the first fantasy series, because there's these first 5 tablets, and that was just the story I told you about, where they go kill this demigod. But then after that, there's another total of 12 tablets, so it's like the first Robert Jordan series that came out over time. But the concept of Gilgamesh is the concept that runs through fantasy all through most of history, which is the heroic quest, which is you have a person who is up against an impossible odds. He has to do something that no one else could ever do, and in fact, he can't even do it, but somehow he succeeds through bravery, tenacity, determination, all this. He gets the job done, and that's what makes him a hero. Then you have, going into the Middle Ages, you have King Arthur. And King Arthur's, the Legends of King Arthur are kind of fascinating because it's actually the first fanfic. Then you have fairy tales. And as anyone's ever read the actual Grimm's fairy tales, you know these are not stories you read your children before they go to bed because they won't sleep. George MacDonald. Now George MacDonald, he actually has a quote that says, "I write not for children but for the childlike, whether they be 5 or 50 or 75. He was the first person who decided to write fantasy for adults. It wasn't until the 1890s when a man by the name of William Morris wrote Well at the World's End and The Wood Beyond the World, which were the first actual invented world. They had nothing to do with this planet at all. Which is probably, the reason I did the same thing is you can't get in trouble for that. You can have horses that run for all day and all night, and you can't say, well, you can't do that. Well, in my world, my horses have a lot of stamina. I always figure that's why people invented fantasy, just because we don't want to do research. So, in that respect, Morris did this, but he also based it completely on the medieval epics and the heroes. But he also wrote it in that kind of archaic, very majestic King Arthurian legend kind of language. I was reading Hemingway's, some of his books, and he was actually talking about how his books are very trimmed down. There's no extra words in those at all. And he noticed that when you do that, when you trim it down to the point where the reader has no trouble reading at all, that the emotional impact is stronger. That when you have a book like Dickens or Shakespeare, you have to transport it more intellectually. So it's a more intellectual experience. But if you write it in a very simple fashion, it's almost like watching a movie. You can't turn off the information coming in. It's coming in at a fast rate. You hear the music, you see the blood, you see the action. So you're going to be emotionally invested in that movie. And in a way, that's what Hemingway was doing by trimming it down to the point where you're reading without even realizing you're reading because it's just flowing right by your eyes. So that impact's hitting you a lot. It's not that one's right and one's wrong, or I like one more than the other. They're both great, but it's just different ways of doing things. And so I actually had a much more casual approach to it. I didn't write in the archaic language that people in my books speak normally as if they were today. Because my thought was, if you lived in that day and age, if you read Chaucer in that day and age, it wouldn't seem stilted, it wouldn't seem hard to understand. I wanted to bring you to a familiar place and say, this is where you've always lived. So you'll get the jokes, you'll get the slang. So I try not to make it in a very difficult sounding language. I want to make it easy. But it really wasn't until Tolkien that things really got going. But he kind of took William Morris's idea and made it more accessible to the people today. In respect that he cleaned up the language, it's not as obtuse, it's not as dense of reading. It's more emotional, you feel more for the characters. So he actually took that kind of older idea and made it more digestible by our standards. He made it more commercial, if you will. And he did a very good job, because if you happen to look him up right now, if you look at the top all-time selling novels throughout all of history, he holds spot 3 and 4, selling 150 million copies of Lord of the Rings, and I believe 100 million copies of The Hobbit. The #1 spot is Tale of Two Cities by Dickens. So he's doing really, really well. Interestingly enough, if you look at the list of the most sold novels of all time, none of them are on the Pulitzer Prize or Nobel Prize winning lists. I'm not sure why that is. What I think happened was, a lot of people like me read and fell in love with Tolkien between the 60s and 70s, and then they grew up and became writers. And the first thing they wanted to do was bring Frodo and Sam back from the Grey Havens, because they were missing them, so they started writing books just like that. They wrote a lot of books just like that, so many books that people started getting really angry about it. So a lot of people copied it, and this created a backlash. A lot of individuals really got tired of the same story over and over and over. So what happened was, around the mid-1984, I believe it was, a guy named Glenn Cook came out with a book called The Black Company, which is considered, I think, by most people to be the original dark and gritty. The good guys aren't always the good guys, the bad guys aren't always the bad guys. He didn't follow the Tolkien trend. Now, it seems kind of strange to me to try and bring realism into fantasy, because if you bring realism into fantasy, and it's not really fantasy anymore, it's real. But they didn't want Superman. They didn't want people who were invincible. They also didn't want evil for evil's sake. I mean, Sauron is just evil. He's the concept of evil. You never actually see him in the book, which is something the publisher had a huge problem with, because it's like, you have a bad guy who doesn't even appear in the book. Everyone wanted more realism. And then we come to George R.R. Martin. And what he actually said in an interview once was he wanted to kind of take Aragorn from the Lord of the Rings. He gets to become king. And then, what happens? Would he be a good king? Would a guy who is so honorable and good that he was able to do what he did to get that position, would he make a good king? And if you happen to have seen the HBO series, which he recently came out with, or read the books, you know that Eddard Stark has a lot of problems because of the fact that he is honorable, and he doesn't believe in being underhanded or sneaky or conniving, and that ends up causing lots of troubles. I won't spoil anything for you. Now, the problem I have actually with dark and gritty, although I didn't even know there was dark and gritty when I started writing, so I kind of exempted myself, was that they take the hero's journey out. It's no longer there, because they don't believe in heroes. Heroes don't exist. Heroes aren't real people. There are no such thing as heroes. Heroes are an accident. So they've taken the hero out of the fantasy story. So for 5,000 years we had these great hero quests, and now those are kind of over because people don't believe in heroes anymore. But the interesting thing is, when I published my books, not knowing this, completely ignorant, I put these books out and I kept getting these emails back. And the comments I heard were, "This was such a refreshing change." I thought, change from what? This is such a refreshing change from the dark and gritty and, you know, cynical and profane. And I'm like, what the heck's going on? I have no idea what's going on with fantasy. It's like, well, this is really odd. But oddly enough, by sheer stupidity, I started a new wave in a way, because people started liking, I remember this when I was a kid. This is the reason I started reading fantasy in the first place. And I went, wow, cool for me. I don't think we need to have it be dark and gritty, and I don't think we need to have it a reproduction of Tolkien. We don't have to have that small boy who's destined, prophesized for greatness. He doesn't have to do that. You don't have to have evil for evil's sake. On the other hand, I don't think you need to make a world where you get rid of that verb form of fantasy, which is what we would fantasize. Because no one here is going to fantasize about getting cancer. You're going to fantasize about winning the lottery. And generally, in the past, it's taken you away from your troubles, not brought you back to them. It doesn't want to compound your troubles, it wants to alleviate them. And usually it wants to take you on a trip where you get to be the hero. As soon as some people here have seen the television show West Wing. And that would be considered by many, I think, more Democrats than Republicans, that that's kind of a fantasy. How we would like to see the government work. And the reason it would be a fantasy, because things work out in that. At the end of episodes, or at the end of these several episodes, things work out the way we want them to. The setting is very realistic, the issues they're talking about are very real, but the way it works out to a positive ending tends to make it more fantasy, at least in my mind. You also have Star Trek, if you don't want to go politics. Star Trek is supposed to be science fiction. However, if you look at it, it's gotten rid of racism, sexism, poverty. It's all gone. That vision of the future is perfect. It is a fantasy of how we would like our future to be. That's what makes it a fantasy. Just in the same way that Tolkien sort of republished Morris's books, and Morris republished the King Arthur books, we repackage fantasy over and over again to suit whatever population trends we have going. And right now, Martin is repackaging it in a negative light. I don't know if anyone's ever seen the movie It Could Happen to You, but it's about a police officer in New York who couldn't pay his waitress's tip. So he tells her, I've got this lottery ticket, and I'll give you half of it, no matter what I get. And it turns out he gets a windfall, he gets $7 million, and he's going to give her a couple $1 million. And I had a friend living at our house, and they saw this, and they said, this is completely ridiculous. Unbelievable, could never happen. There's no sense in even watching this film anymore. It's ridiculous. And I said, well, this actually is based on a true story. But I find it interesting that in this day and age, we have so many people who support and believe in the concept of the dark and gritty fantasy as being the only thing that could be real. That there is no chance that we live in a time where people could be heroes, that people could be going out and helping other people, or who are strong and brave enough to achieve great things. And that's something I found kind of depressing, that we have such a prominence that people who have read my books who don't like it because they are great, dark and gritty people, they look at mine and say, well, it's silly, it's not real. It couldn't possibly be that way. What you're writing about is a fairy tale, and we're tired of fairy tales. We want real things. And I always thought, that's really odd, because those characters aren't, to me, that unbelievable. And in fact, based on my own life, I would say that they're fairly normal. I'm a person who started out, my father was a crane operator in Detroit. My mother, he died when I was 9. My mother was living off of welfare. And now I'm here at the Library of Congress giving a talk about books that I've just published. In that respect, I'm more like those characters, so I see this as a realistic story. But a lot of people apparently don't feel that way. So, in my personal opinion, I feel that we should have actually more stories of this sort, where we have a positive outcome, because it inspires and works as sort of a guide for people to want and can believe that that kind of thing can happen, as opposed to just having the reinforcement of, no, life is terrible, it's just going to stay terrible, and you might as well never try, and, just kill yourself now. So, I'm not sure how you want to take away this thing, is whether gritty is good or bad, but